For years, people told this story the wrong way. They said he was weak. They said he couldn't fight. But the truth is far more unsettling, because the man who changed England forever, I couldn't even stand. He couldn't walk. That's where this story starts. Not with a battle, not with a fleet of ships cutting through gray water. With a boy who couldn't stand up. His bones wouldn't hold him. His legs were useless from birth. In a world built entirely around physical strength, where men were measured by what they could lift, swing, carry, and endure, this child had none of it. The midwives said he wouldn't survive the first winter. His father looked at him and said nothing. Ragnar Lothbrok, the most feared Viking of his generation, held this broken child and saw something that everyone else in that room completely missed. Not weakness, not a burden. Something else entirely. Viking society had one currency: strength. Everything ran on it. Status, respect, survival. All of it flowed from what your body could do. Warriors trained from childhood. The sons of powerful men were expected to become powerful men. That was the only path available. Do A. Ivar had no path. His brothers grew strong. He watched. They trained with swords and axes, developed the muscle and the reflexes that Viking warfare demanded. Ivar sat on the ground and observed. He couldn't participate, so he did something none of them thought to do. He paid attention. He listened to every story the old poets told about past campaigns. He memorized every battle his father had ever fought. What worked, what failed, and why. He cataloged the political alliances between clans, the trade routes, the hidden vulnerabilities of every rival leader. While his brothers were building their bodies, Ivar was building something that doesn't have a physical form. A complete picture of how power actually works. By the time he was still a child, he understood strategy better than men who had fought for decades. And he had one other weapon that no one in that hall recognized as a weapon at all. His words. Warriors who made the mistake of mocking his legs learned quickly what a precisely placed sentence could do. Ivar had spent years studying people, watching faces, reading rooms, identifying exactly where each man's confidence was weakest. When he chose to use that knowledge, the result was more devastating than any physical blow. 3 seasoned warriors, publicly humiliated by a boy who had never stood up. No one mocked him twice. Ragnar watched all of this, and he understood that he hadn't fathered a weak son. He had fathered something the Vikings had never quite produced before. The proof came when Ivar was still young. Ragnar gathered his sons and gave them a test. Plan a raid on a fortified monastery in Northumbria. The son with the best plan leads the real expedition. His brothers gave Viking answers: frontal assault, night attack, siege until starvation. All proven methods. All the kind of thinking that had worked for generations of raiders. Then Ivar spoke. He didn't propose an attack. He proposed a trap. Here's the thing: he had studied the Christians. He understood how they thought, what they valued, what they couldn't resist. A monastery wouldn't open its gates to Vikings, but monks who believed in mercy and conversion. They would march out voluntarily to help a small group of apparently helpless, shipwrecked pagans. So that's what he gave them: 20 Vikings on a beach. A story of a shipwreck, an appeal to Christian charity. While the monks and their guards marched toward the coast to capture and convert these vulnerable heathens, 200 warriors waited in the forest. And while those defenders were away from the monastery, the actual target, Ivar, took it from the other direction. He didn't attack the monastery. He made the monastery come to him. But that wasn't the most dangerous part. What he understood about people would become far more destructive than any weapon. Think about what that means. He was 11 years old, or close to it. And he had already understood something that most military commanders never fully grasp. You don't fight your enemy's strength. You weaponize their beliefs. The raid succeeded completely. Not a single Viking lost on the walls. Ivar carried out of the battle on his shield, directing it from above the chaos. Ragnar entered the monastery 3 days later and found his crippled son seated in the abbot's chair, surrounded by organized piles of looted treasure, with a sealed leather tube of stolen maps resting against the throne. Maps of every fortified location in Northumbria, every monastery, every Saxon garrison, with annotated troop counts. That was the moment Ragnar stopped seeing a son with a disability. He saw what Ivar actually was. But here is the thing most people miss about Ivar. The disability wasn't just something he overcame. It was his advantage. Every other Viking warrior had to be in the fight. They were trained for it, expected to be in the middle of it, measured by their performance inside the chaos of combat. Ivar was always outside it, carried above the battlefield on a shield, pulled by 4 men. He had a view of the entire engagement that no warrior on the ground ever had. He never got pulled into the moment. He never made decisions driven by adrenaline or fear or the tunnel vision that combat produces. He watched, he directed, he adjusted. A warrior on the ground sees maybe 10 feet in any direction. Smoke, shields, bodies, noise, everything collapses into immediate survival. There is no strategy at that range. There is only reaction. Ivar saw the whole field, always. The direction a flank was bending. The gap opening in the enemy line before the enemy knew it was there. The moment to push and the moment to hold. The condition that everyone assumed made him less than a warrior had placed him permanently in the only position from which you can actually see a battle clearly. How do you lead an army when you can't walk into battle? You don't walk, you see. Then Ragnar died. He sailed to Northumbria with 2 ships and a deliberately small force, something closer to a final statement than a military operation. King Ella captured him, executed him publicly, threw him into a pit of snakes. No one moved. No one spoke. They just watched. The news reached Ivar's brothers like a lit torch dropped into dry wood. Attack now. Avenge him immediately. Every instinct, every cultural obligation, every emotion demanded it. Ivar said, "Wait." More than that, he accepted Ella's terms. He agreed to peace. He swore oaths to never again attack Saxon lands. His brothers thought they were watching a surrender. Some of his father's warriors thought they were watching cowardice. And that response, that impossible, counterintuitive patience, was the most frightening thing Ivar ever did. Because while everyone assumed he had accepted defeat, he had already started building something no single Viking fleet could produce. He needed rage, organized at scale. He needed every powerful leader across Scandinavia, united behind a single purpose. He needed the story of Ragnar's death to spread until no warrior in the Norse world could hear it without feeling it personally. So he traveled. He told the story everywhere. He let it grow. He let the fury build in every hall, every village, every man who had ever respected Ragnar Lothbrok and now heard how he died. And this is where everything changes. Because revenge was never the real plan. And then, when the rage was at its peak, when it had nowhere to go, he organized it. The Great Heathen Army. Over 300 ships. The largest Viking fleet ever assembled for a single coordinated purpose. Ancient rivals, standing in the same harbor. United by a story Ivar had been carefully cultivating for years. This was not a raid. Previous Viking operations came to England, took what they could carry, and sailed home. The sea crossing was profit-seeking, not conquest. They had no intention of staying. Ivar had a different intention entirely. These ships carried not just warriors, but families, craftsmen, settlers, animals, tools. This fleet wasn't coming to plunder England. It was coming to replace it. Think about what that required. Not just military planning, political architecture, convincing dozens of rival leaders, men who had spent generations fighting each other, to subordinate their ambitions to a single coordinated operation. To cross the sea not for a season's raiding but for permanent settlement. To commit to years of campaign in a foreign country under shared command. Ivar built that coalition out of a story about his father's death. That's the scale of what his words could produce. And here's what no one expected. By the time they landed, the Saxons had no frame of reference for what they were looking at. Nothing in their experience of Viking raids had prepared them for this scale, this organization, this permanence. 3 kingdoms fell in under 6 years. Each one fell differently because each one required a different approach. Ivar studied his enemies before engaging them, the same way he had studied the Christians at Lindisfarne as a child. He knew their defenses, their alliances, their political fractures. He knew which kingdoms would collapse from military pressure and which needed to be isolated first, cut off from potential support. Every victory was engineered. The battles were almost the last step in a process that had already decided the outcome. By the time the Saxons understood his pattern, the pattern had already finished with them. That left Northumbria, Ella's kingdom, the man who had thrown Ragnar into the snake pit. Ivar's brothers had wanted to attack years earlier, driven by grief and the need to act. Ivar had made them wait, not because he wasn't ready to avenge his father, but because he understood that the right revenge wasn't fast, it was total. He took East Anglia first, then other territories. He let Ella watch from a distance as the Viking army consumed everything around him. He let the reports arrive at Northumbrian court city by city, kingdom by kingdom, and he let the knowledge sit there, accumulating. By the time the Great Heathen Army arrived at York, Ella had already been watching his world shrink for years. The siege was brief. The walls of York fell. Ella was brought before Ivar. For years, he had been waiting for this moment. Not for battle, for something much more final. A Saxon king, kneeling in front of a man who couldn't stand. That image alone says more about Ivar than any battle description could. The snake pit was constructed the same way Ragnar's had been. Ivar didn't do this out of anger. There was no anger left. He did it with the same clinical precision he applied to everything. A circle was opened years ago. He was closing it. Ragnar had died in that specific way, in front of witnesses, as a display of Saxon power. Ella would die in that specific way, in front of witnesses, as a display of what patience and intelligence can eventually produce. Ivar watched until it was done. Then, he moved on. That's not revenge. That's something else. It's the completion of a plan so long-range that most people couldn't have held it in their heads for the years it required. After England, Ivar disappears from the historical record. No dramatic final battle, no documented death. He is simply gone. The chronicles stop mentioning him. What remains is the Danelaw. Half of England under Viking law, Viking customs, Viking language. The territories Ivar's army settled and held became the foundation of something that outlasted everyone involved. Place names in England today, Derby, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, dozens of others, carry the linguistic mark of the settlements his army established. Legal traditions, administrative structures, patterns of land ownership traces run all the way back to the world the Great Heathen Army built and refused to leave. A man who couldn't walk changed the map of England permanently. He never stood on the land he conquered. He didn't need to. Most people still don't know his name. They use the place names every day, but they walk on the land he changed every single day.